Welcome to Racism in the 1930s and 1960s. I'm Gavin Woody and I done Racism in the 1930s. Racism, 1930s. Black people were paid less than their white counterparts and had to work harder too. Black people wanted to change the way they were treated, but it was very difficult for them to do this as a result of the Jim Crow law. Discrimination was large in the 30s, but even when the book was wrote in the 60s, it was still going on and still mattered due to society. No one wanted to change because white thought they were right no matter what. Racism is a product of complex interaction in a given society. The Jim Crow laws was enforced between 1876 and 1965. Discrimination was a big deal. Whites and blacks didn't share mix or even stand in the same place. Racism is due to views of ethnicity.
My name is Sierra Kelly. My part of the project is the 1960s. The 1960s. Many Americans believed they were standing at the dawn of a golden age. By the end of 1960, the country was falling apart. The 1960s was a time of revolution in American life and culture. It affected education, values, lifestyle, as well as entertainment. Many people were oppressed and therefore could not live life how they wanted. Jim Crow laws were passed by the southern states that created a racial system in the American South. By 1914, laws effectively created two separate societies, one black and one white. Black and whites could not ride together in the same car, sit in the same waiting room, sit in the same theater, go to the same school, or eat in the same restaurant. Martin Luther King Jr. drew people by giving speeches to the American public to change people's minds on segregation and put the end to racism. During the 1960s, the civil rights movement began and a new era of violence for the KKK. Black Americans struggled for equality in the 1950s and 1960s. Earlier in the century, many states passed Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were named for a song sung about a white character in the mid-1900s who copied popular black singing and dancing. On August 28, 1963, thousands of people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. The emerging leader of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr., gave his famous speech, "I Had a Dream." Continued protests, boycotts, and marches slowly convinced Americans to seriously consider major changes to the way blacks and whites were treated in America.
Hi, my name is Poj, and my part of this project is what is the difference between the 1930s and 1960s? The differences between the 1930s and 1960s. The 1930s were a time when the United States was in isolation. It had been through World War I and did not want to get involved in another war. Therefore, the US did not do much internationally in this decade. The 1960s are more commonly compared to the 1920s, but there are some comparisons to the 1930s that can be drawn. The 1960s were a time of major social ferment. The civil rights movement and the counterculture anti-war movement made this a very unsettled time socially. Of course, the 1930s were unsettled, but they were unsettled in a completely different way. Also, the 1930s was a time when people were having to adapt to the Great Depression, which was a social change forced on them, whereas the social change of the 1960s came about voluntarily.
My name is Tyson Edwards, and the part of my project is the civil rights movement. Civil rights movement. This was a nonviolent protest during the 1950s through the 60s. It lasted 14 years, mainly in the South. The government responded to this situation immediately. This picture shows how African Americans are protesting to make all rights equal. Little Rock, Arkansas. This was an important location for the civil rights movement. The governor, he sent troops so non-African American students couldn't enter the building. President Eisenhower, he sent the National Guard to protect the harassed students. This is Little Rock, Arkansas. So the National Guard can protect the harassed students. Population. African Americans grew from 44,000 to 235,000. Oscar D. Priest. He was symbolized as the first black congressman. Segregation. This lasted for another generation until 1966.
I'm Keaton Ledford, and I do Why the Book Still Mattered Between the 1930s and 1960s. Why the book still mattered, 1930 and 1960. Unfairness. It mattered because it was unfair to African Americans. Hard time for African Americans. Due to Jim Crow laws, life was hard for African Americans. Discrimination was still a problem. From 1930 to 1960, the book made a difference because discrimination was still a problem in the United States. The Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan was a big ordeal in the 30s. They killed blacks and government officials. Discrimination was what became widespread. But not only did discrimination become large in the 30s, but people had no longer trust for others. People feared everyone. People feared each other because they didn't understand things. So they had someone or something to blame it on. Cause of popularity. The book was a hit because the same problems were still going on and discrimination was still large. Why do people still care? People still cared because they were raised not to hate or dislike some things or some people, never really told differently. How did the problems last so long? Problems lasted so long because of the way people were taught and the only way they knew how to act around other people with other differences. Why did it start? It started because people felt kind of threatened by other people and of their differences.